Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're taking a deep dive into Niall Ferguson's Colossus, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire.
Yeah.
This book, it really kind of throws down the gauntlet, arguing that the U.S., despite all this talk about exceptionalism, has always been an empire, often in denial of that very fact.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how Ferguson doesn't just make this assertion. He really dives deep into history.
Yeah.
Comparing the U.S. to 69 other historical empires
Mm.
to demonstrate how common empires actually are.
Right.
And he contends that the U.S. exhibits many of the hallmarks of an empire.
Yeah.
A sprawling global military presence, frequent interventions in foreign conflicts, and this kind of subtle yet pervasive promotion of its values and culture worldwide.
Yeah, you're right. And it's not just about military might either. I think one of the most striking points that Ferguson makes is how the U.S. has often used its economic influence as well to shape the global landscape. He draws a really compelling comparison between the American and British empires, suggesting that while the British fostered global growth through trade and investment, the U.S. achieves a similar effect through its economic and cultural dominance today.
Precisely. And think about it. Hollywood movies, fast food chains, popular music. These aren't just forms of entertainment. They represent American soft power, shaping tastes and aspirations across the globe. And Ferguson argues that this cultural influence is a key tool in the American imperial toolkit.
For sure. But it's not just about the present either. Ferguson takes us way back to the roots of American expansion, back to its early history, and he reminds us that the acquisition of territories, like the Louisiana Purchase, Texas, California, really solidify the U.S. as an expansionist power from the get-go.
Absolutely. And what's so intriguing is that Ferguson doesn't shy away from the complexities and contradictions inherent in American expansionism. He points to instances where the U.S. showed restraint, like its failure to annex Canada, for instance, which leaves us with a somewhat arbitrary border, drawn along lines of latitude. And he uses this example to illustrate the push and pull between America's expansionist impulses and its own internal resistance to the idea of empire.
Yeah. This internal struggle has shaped American foreign policy throughout history, and this tension is particularly evident. When Ferguson analyzes the U.S. involvement in the Middle East, he highlights how competing interests, oil, Israel, containing Soviet influence, have all contributed to this kind of tangled web of interventions, often with unintended consequences.
Yeah, for sure. And this is where Ferguson introduces this really interesting concept, the imperialism of anti-imperialism, arguing that even when the U.S. claimed to be fighting against imperialism, it often ended up engaging in its own form of empire building. Take, for example, the interventions in Japan and Germany after World War II. The U.S. sought to democratize and rebuild these nations, but it also undeniably shaped them in its own image, promoting its values and institutions.
It makes you wonder about the true motivations behind many of these interventions. Were they purely altruistic attempts to spread democracy and freedom? Or were they, at least in part, driven by a desire to secure American dominance and promote its own interests?
That's the question Ferguson forces us to confront. He reminds us that power dynamics are rarely straightforward, and that even seemingly benevolent actions can have complex and unintended consequences. He argues that understanding these nuances is crucial for analyzing the American empire and its role in the world.
Yeah, I think one of the most impactful passages in the book is when Ferguson compares the swift American withdrawal from Iraq after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein with the prolonged British occupation of Egypt. He suggests that the British, despite their flaws, understood that successful nation-building requires a sustained commitment, a willingness to go there and stay there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting contrast. The toppling of Saddam's statue became this symbol of American victory, but it also foreshadowed the challenges to come. The U.S. seemed eager to declare mission accomplished and move on, while the difficult work of establishing a stable and functioning state remained unfinished.
And this aversion to long-term commitments, it's a theme that runs throughout the book. Ferguson suggests that it's a fundamental weakness of the American empire, stemming from this deep-seated reluctance to fully embrace the burdens of global leadership.
Right. And this reluctance becomes even more critical when we consider the rise of potential rivals to American power. So Ferguson analyzes the strengths and weaknesses of the European Union, acknowledging its economic and demographic might, but also highlighting its internal divisions and its difficulty in forging a unified foreign policy.
He even compares the EU to the Byzantine Empire, a power with immense cultural and economic influence, but ultimately lacking the military might to truly challenge its rivals.
And then, of course, there's China. Ferguson acknowledges China's remarkable economic growth. and its potential to become a formidable military power in the long term. And he points to this striking fact that American aid actually fueled the economic recoveries of both Japan and Germany after World War II, potentially laying the groundwork for future economic competition.
It's a thought-provoking observation. It makes you wonder if in its efforts to contain communism and promote stability, the U.S. inadvertently sowed the seeds for its own future challenges.
It's a reminder that the global landscape is constantly shifting, and that even the most powerful empires are not immune to the forces of history.
Speaking of the forces of history, Ferguson doesn't just focus on the present and future. He takes us on this journey through past American interventions, reminding us that the U.S. has a long and complex history of involvement in global affairs. He cites over 168 instances of American armed intervention between 1946 and 1965 alone.
Wow. It's a stark reminder that the U.S. has never been a passive observer on the world stage. It's always been willing to use its power to shape events, whether through military force, economic influence, or cultural diplomacy.
And this brings us to one of the most central questions in the book. Can the U.S. sustain its global dominance in the face of these rising challenges? Can it learn from the successes and failures of past empires to forge a more sustainable and effective form of global leadership?
That's the question that really gets to the heart of Ferguson's argument, and he doesn't offer any easy answers. Instead, he presents us with this really compelling analysis of the American empire, its contradictions, its strengths, and its vulnerabilities, urging us to grapple with these questions and to consider the implications for the future.
And speaking of vulnerabilities, Ferguson doesn't shy away from highlighting the potential weaknesses of the American empire. He points to a looming fiscal crisis driven by unsustainable levels of debt, a growing dependence on foreign capital, and the looming specter of a dollar crisis.
Yeah, these are serious challenges that could undermine American power and influence in the long run. Ferguson even evokes the image of Samson, the biblical strongman, blinded and chained in Gaza, capable only of blind destruction.
Wow.
It's a powerful metaphor for the potential consequences of overreach and the dangers of clinging to power without adapting to changing realities.
It's a sobering thought.
Okay.
But before we get too deep into the potential for decline, let's take a closer look at some of the specific challenges and opportunities facing the American empire. One of the key issues Ferguson explores is this idea of the overstretched Colossus. He paints a somewhat bleak picture of the U.S.'s long-term prospects, pointing to unsustainable levels of debt and the impending Social Security and Medicare crisis.
It's a sobering analysis. He argues that the U.S. has become too reliant on foreign capital inflows to finance its massive current account deficit, leaving it vulnerable to a potential dollar crisis if global investors lose confidence. And it's not just about economics. Ferguson also highlights the manpower constraints facing the U.S. military, contrasting it with historical empires that relied heavily on colonial troops.
Right.
He suggests that the U.S.'s aversion to long-term deployments and the burdens of empire could limit its ability to project power effectively.
So we've got this picture of an overstretched Colossus, burdened by debt, facing a potential dollar crisis, and struggling to maintain its military commitments around the world. It's a pretty bleak picture. But is it the whole story?
It's certainly a crucial part of the story. But Ferguson doesn't just focus on the negatives. He also explores potential solutions and strategies for the U.S. to adapt and maintain its global leadership.
Okay, so that's where the real discussion starts. What can the U.S. do to address these challenges and secure its position in the world?
That's a great place to pick up in our next segment. We'll delve deeper into Ferguson's analysis of the American empire, exploring his proposed solutions and his assessment of the U.S.'s long-term prospects. So we've kind of established, that the U.S. faces some serious challenges. But what are Ferguson's proposed solutions? Well, he argues that the U.S. needs to develop a more sophisticated understanding, I think, of the complexities of power dynamics and the long-term challenges of maintaining global order.
He doesn't advocate for, retreating from the world stage, though, does he?
No, not at all. He actually argues for a more engaged and strategic approach to global leadership, one that recognizes the necessity of long-term commitments and the burdens of empire.
Okay, so not isolationism, but what does that look like in practice?
Well, Ferguson suggests that the U.S. can't simply rely on its military and economic dominance to maintain its position. He emphasizes the need to cultivate the soft power of its values and institutions, promoting democracy, free markets, and the rule of law. He also argues that the U.S. needs to be more honest with itself about its imperial role, recognizing that it has often intervened in other countries for its own benefit, not just for altruistic reasons.
That's a tough pill to swallow, I think, acknowledging that our actions haven't always been purely driven by spreading democracy.
It is, but Ferguson argues that this honesty is crucial for developing a more sustainable and effective foreign policy. He points out that the U.S. has often been quick to intervene militarily, but much less willing to engage in the long, arduous task of nation building.
He uses the British occupation of Egypt as a contrast again, right?
Exactly. Despite its flaws, the British occupation of Egypt ultimately led to significant institutional and economic development. Ferguson suggests that this is because the British were willing to make a long-term commitment to truly invest in building up the institutions and infrastructure necessary for a stable and prosperous society.
So what you're saying is, Ferguson thinks the U.S. needs to adopt a more nuanced approach, one that combines military strength with a willingness to engage in the complexities of nation building.
Yes, and he goes a step further. He argues that the U.S. needs to be more selective in its interventions, focusing on areas where it has a clear strategic interest and a realistic chance of success. He even suggests that the U.S. might need to learn to accept a more multipolar world, where other powers like China play a larger role. He doesn't suggest that the U.S. should become an isolationist nation. However, he does take aim at the UN, questioning its effectiveness as a global policeman, and pointing to its failures in places like Rwanda and Bosnia.
So acknowledging our limits and being more strategic in how we use our power.
Precisely. And being willing to work with other nations and institutions to address global challenges. Ferguson believes that this type of approach is essential for the U.S. to maintain its leadership role in the 21st century.
It sounds like he's advocating for a kind of enlightened self-interest, where the U.S. uses its power to promote its own interests, but also recognizes the need to contribute to a more stable and prosperous world order.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between power and responsibility, between asserting American leadership and recognizing the limits of American power.
It's interesting that he doesn't shy away from controversy either. He even argues that, while multilateralism is important, the U.S. can't always rely on international institutions to address global challenges. Sometimes he says the U.S. needs to be willing to act decisively, even unilaterally when necessary, to protect its interests and promote its values.
Right. He's not advocating for reckless unilateralism, but he's acknowledging that there will be times when the U.S. needs to act alone, even if it means facing criticism from the international community.
That's a tough call to make. But it sounds like he's saying that sometimes it's necessary to be the bad guy, if it means doing what's right for the long term.
That's a fair assessment. And it leads into one of the most thought-provoking aspects of the book, his analysis of the potential for a decline in American power. He argues that the U.S. is facing a perfect storm of challenges, a looming fiscal crisis, a dependence on foreign capital, and rising rivals like China.
This is where he uses the analogy of Samson, right?
Well,
Blinded and chained, capable only of destruction. It's a pretty stark image.
it is, and it highlights the potential consequences of clinging to power without adapting to changing realities. Ferguson argues that the U.S. needs to be proactive in addressing these challenges if it wants to avoid the fate of past empires.
So what does he suggest the U.S. do to prevent this decline? It feels like we're getting to the crux of the book.
You're absolutely right, and Ferguson doesn't shy away from offering potential solutions.
Well, let's hear them. What does he propose?
He suggests that the U.S. needs to get its fiscal house in order, reduce its dependence on foreign capital, and invest in its long-term economic competitiveness. He also advocates for a more strategic approach to military spending, focusing on maintaining technological superiority and developing capabilities that will be relevant in the 21st century.
So it's not just about cutting spending or building more weapons. It's about being smarter and more strategic in how we use our resources.
Exactly. He argues that the U.S. needs to shift its focus from short-term gains to long-term sustainability. He acknowledges that decline is not inevitable. The U.S. still has tremendous strengths: its innovative economy, its dynamic culture, and its enduring ideals.
It sounds like he's urging the U.S. to learn from the mistakes of past empires, to recognize the dangers of overreach and hubris, and to adapt to the changing realities of the 21st century. It's a call to action.
It is, and it's a call to action that goes beyond policymakers and politicians. He argues that every American has a role to play in shaping the future of the American empire.
What does he mean by that? How can ordinary citizens influence something as complex as foreign policy?
He believes that Americans need to be more informed and engaged in the debates about America's role in the world. He encourages us to look beyond the rhetoric of exceptionalism and to confront the realities of American power, both its potential and its limitations.
So it's about educating ourselves, having those difficult conversations, and holding our leaders accountable for making wise decisions. That will ensure a brighter future for the U.S. and for the world.
Exactly. He's reminding us that the future of the American empire is not predetermined. It's up to us, the citizens, to shape the course of history.
It's both a daunting and inspiring message. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of such complex global challenges. But Ferguson reminds us that we all have a part to play.
He doesn't offer easy answers or simple solutions, but he does provide a powerful framework for thinking about America's place in the world. And that's what makes Colossus such a compelling read.
It's a book that challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to think critically about the nature of power, and to engage in a meaningful dialogue about the future of the American empire.
And ultimately, it's a book that leaves us with a sense of hope. Hope that despite the challenges we face, the U.S. can still play a positive role in the world, not as a domineering colossus, but as a responsible and engaged leader working in partnership with other nations to create a more just and sustainable world order. I think that's a perfect point to stop for now.
I agree. Let's take a moment to absorb all of these ideas and reconvene for our final segment. All right, so I think we're ready to kind of jump back in.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the historical roots of the American empire to the challenges that it faces today, in the 21st century.
Yeah, and we touched on some of Ferguson's proposed solutions. His call for a more nuanced and strategic approach to global leadership.
But there's one question that's been lingering in my mind throughout this whole discussion. It's the question that Ferguson poses at the very heart of Colossus. Can the U.S. overcome its historical aversion to empire and truly embrace the responsibilities of global leadership?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a question that I think each listener needs to kind of grapple with on their own. Because Ferguson doesn't offer a definitive answer. Instead, he presents a really compelling case for both sides of the argument, highlighting the potential benefits and risks of American power.
He kind of leaves us with this image of the U.S. standing at a crossroads, facing a choice between continuing down a path of unsustainable overreach or forging a new path, one that balances power with responsibility, self-interest with global cooperation. Is a powerful image.
It is, and it really underscores the urgency, I think, of the choices that we face. Ferguson reminds us that history is full of examples of empires that rose to great heights, only to crumble under the weight of their own hubris and overreach.
So he's not suggesting that the U.S. is destined for decline, though, is he?
Right. No, not necessarily. He believes that the U.S. still has the potential to be a force for good in the world. But he also warns that this potential can only be realized if the U.S. learns from the mistakes of the past and adapts to the changing realities of the present.
So it's not a foregone conclusion. The future of the American empire is still being written.
Exactly. And that's where you, the listener, come in. Ferguson's book isn't just like a passive historical analysis. It's a call to action, an invitation to engage in a vital conversation about the future we want to create.
It's about recognizing that we all have a stake in this. The decisions our leaders make, the actions we take as citizens, will have a profound impact on the course of history.
Absolutely. He encourages us to be informed, to engage in thoughtful debate, and to hold our leaders accountable for making wise and responsible choices. He challenges us to move beyond simplistic narratives and partisan divisions, and to really grapple with the complexities of power, the dilemmas of empire, and the challenges of forging a more just and sustainable world order.
It was a tall order, but it's a challenge worthy of our best efforts.
It is. And as we conclude this deep dive into Colossus, I think it's fitting to leave you with Ferguson's own words. He writes, "The greatest danger facing the United States is not that it will cease to be an empire, but that it will remain one, by default rather than by design."
Those are powerful words. He's really urging us to be deliberate, to make conscious choices about the kind of empire we want to be, the kind of role we want to play in the world.
And that's a challenge I think we all need to take seriously. The future of the American empire, and indeed the future of the world, may very well depend on it.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Niall Ferguson's Colossus. I hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to explore these ideas further.
It's a book that raises more questions than it answers. But that's precisely what makes it so valuable. It forces us to think critically, to engage in meaningful dialogue, and to grapple with the complex realities of our world.
So to our listeners, we leave you with this final thought. What do you think? Can the U.S. overcome its historical aversion to empire and forge a new path, one that balances power with responsibility and contributes to a more just and peaceful world? We encourage you to continue this conversation, to explore Ferguson's arguments, and to arrive at your own conclusions.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning,
And on her.
keep those pages turning.